We must tell you, before anything else, that she was 47 years old and she had nothing left to lose, because everything had already been taken from her. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield, though the town of Larkspur Hollow, tucked high against the shoulder of the Bitterroot Range in the Montana Territory, had always called her Nell, and by the autumn of 1897, that same town watched in silence as the banker Josiah Crane nailed a foreclosure notice to the door of the boarding house she had run alone since her husband's death, and did nothing to stop it. She walked away from that house with $11.40 sewn into the hem of her coat, a needle case that had belonged to her mother, and no roof to call her own. 3 days later, at a county auction of salvage lumber from the condemned mountain chapel above the pass, while other bidders fought over pews and bell brass and stained glass, she paid $3 for the one thing nobody wanted at all, a solid, half-buried block of gray stone that had served as the chapel's altar, said by old-timers to be haunted, said to be cursed, said to hold something that should never be disturbed. She bought it only because she needed a flat surface to build on and could afford nothing better, and everyone who watched her drag away on a borrowed sledge called it a fool's purchase. They did not know that sealed inside that stone was a secret that had waited 46 years to be found, a secret that would not only change the whole shape of Eleanor Whitfield's life, but would give back to an entire town the one thing it had quietly lost without ever knowing it was gone. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Whitfield. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten, the way that old chapel was forgotten, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Eleanor had not always been a woman who counted pennies sewn into a coat hem. She had been born Eleanor and Doyle in 1850 in a modest cabin outside a Kentucky hill town, the second daughter of a quiet, careful mother named Ruth who took in mending from half the county and who taught Eleanor, almost before she could properly hold a spoon, how to hold a needle instead. Ruth Doyle was not a woman given to sentiment about her work. She believed, and said so often enough that it settled into Eleanor like a bone settles into a body, that there was no such thing as a scrap of cloth too poor to be useful, no seam too small to be done honestly, and no person too plain or too poor to deserve careful, patient work done well. Cheap does not mean worthless, she would say, turning a frayed collar under the lamp. It only means nobody has looked at it closely yet. Eleanor grew up believing that with her whole heart, and it shaped the way she saw everything afterward. Old coats, old barns, old people the town had stopped listening to, and eventually, though she could not have known it then, old stones nobody wanted. She married young, at 19, a steady, sunburned man named Thomas Whitfield who had come through Kentucky driving cattle west and stayed only long enough to fall in love with her. And within the year, the two of them had joined a wagon party bound for the high grazing country of the Montana Territory, where Thomas had heard there was open land still to be claimed along a creek beneath a mountain pass called Larkspur. They arrived in the spring of 1871 to find a scattering of homesteads clustered loosely around that creek, a scattering that would slowly, over the following decades, knit itself into the small but proud town of Larkspur Hollow, a general store, a schoolhouse, a modest bank, and eventually, in the summer of 1875, a boarding house that Eleanor built up herself from a two-room cabin, taking in miners and drovers and traveling clergy, feeding them, mending their clothes, and listening, always, listening to the stories they carried in with the dust on their boots. It was through that listening that Eleanor first heard, in fragments over many years, the old legend of the mountain chapel that stood above the pass. A small stone building erected, so the story went sometime around 1851, before the town itself properly existed, by a stonemason named Emmett Doyle. It struck her, the first time she heard the name, that it was so near her own maiden name that she asked twice to be sure she'd heard correctly, and was told, with a shrug, that plenty of Doyles had come west, and there was no reason to think it any relation. The chapel, the story went, had been built in memory of a young bride named Marguerite, said to have died of sudden fever on the very eve of her wedding, before she ever stood at the altar, and the grieving town of that earlier, half-formed settlement had raised a little stone chapel on the mountain as a place to remember her. Over the decades that followed, as the town grew and moved its center down nearer the creek, the chapel had fallen slowly out of use, attended only a few times a year, then hardly at all, until by the time Eleanor arrived, it was already spoken of the way people speak of something both sacred and slightly frightening. A place children were warned not to wander to alone, a place where old women insisted. The bride who died before her wedding still lingered, still kept some kind of watch. Nell had always found the story more sad than frightening. She had lost enough in her own life by then to know that grief does not always leave when the mourners do. Thomas Whitfield died in the winter of 1895, crushed beneath a rock slide while helping shore up a failing silver claim he'd taken a small share in, hoping to leave his wife something more than a boarding house and a garden. He left her instead with debts she had not known existed. Chief among them a note held by the town's banker, Josiah Crane, a note Thomas had signed in good faith, and Crane had quietly been buying up pieces of for 2 years, gathering, as it turned out, far more of the town's paper than anyone in Larkspur Hollow yet understood. Eleanor kept the boarding house running through her grief the only way she knew how, with her needle and her patience, taking an extra mending, letting rooms to anyone who could pay, stretching $1 until it nearly wept, and for a while it seemed the debt might be managed. But the winter of 1897 came early and hard, snow burying the mountain roads for 6 additional weeks. Travelers stopped coming through, and the interest on Crane's note, which Eleanor would later learn had been quietly and questionably increased twice in ways she had never been properly told of, swelled past anything she could gather. Josiah Crane was not, on the surface, a cruel man. He smiled easily. He sat near the front of the little community church on Sundays. He had donated, publicly and loudly, toward the schoolhouse roof. But underneath that smiling surface, he had spent years buying up notes and mortgages across Larkspur, hollow the way a careful trapper sets a dozen quiet snares. And when the widow Whitfield's payment came late for the 3rd time, he did not hesitate, nor did he offer the grace a decent man might have offered a grieving widow who had never once failed to try. He foreclosed within the week, citing the letter of the note rather than its spirit, and had the sheriff post a notice on her door on a gray October morning while Eleanor stood in the yard in her apron, her hands raw from scrubbing floors that no longer belonged to her. The townsfolk who saw it happen looked away, the way people do when they are ashamed but not quite ashamed enough to act, and within days Eleanor Whitfield, 47 years old, was left with a small trunk of belongings, her mother's needle case, and $11.40 she had kept hidden and sewn in her coat hem against exactly such a disaster, because her mother had taught her that too, that a careful woman keeps something back that no one else knows to look for. She was not, however, entirely without a foothold. Years before, her mother-in-law had passed down to Thomas a narrow, stony, largely useless strip of creekside land at the far edge of town, ground too steep and too rocky for grazing or planting, which the family had always called Widow's Corner half in jest, long before it ever belonged to an actual widow. Because it carried no value and no mortgage, Crane had not troubled to claim it, and so it was to that bare, brush-choked half-acre that Eleanor Whitfield now carried her trunk, intending to build, if she could manage it, some kind of small shelter before the snow returned in earnest. It was in searching for anything solid enough to serve as a foundation stone that she first heard about the county's salvage auction of the old mountain chapel, which had finally been condemned as unsafe and was being dismantled that same week for its lumber and stone. She arrived at the auction with her 3 remaining dollars held tight in her glove, watching men bid eagerly on pew wood and window glass and the small iron bell, watching the price of everything useful climb higher than she could follow, until at last the auctioneer, sounding almost apologetic, brought forward the one item left unclaimed. The chapel's old stone altar, a heavy, deeply weathered block hewn from gray mountain granite, too large for most wagons, too plain for any collector, and burdened besides with its old reputation, so that even the men who might have used it for a foundation stone shifted uneasily and murmured about the bride who was said to linger near it. Nobody bid. The auctioneer, glancing toward Eleanor almost out of pity, asked if any soul present would take it for even a few dollars just to see it hauled away, and Eleanor, thinking only of the flat, solid surface she desperately needed and nothing at all of ghosts, raised her hand and offered $3 for it, the whole of what she could safely spare. There was some low laughter at that, Not unkind exactly, but the laughter of people who believed a woman who had just lost her home had also, perhaps, lost a portion of her good sense. Eleanor did not mind the laughter nearly so much as she minded the cold, and she paid her $3, and with the help of an old teamster named Silas Pruitt, who took pity on her and would accept only a warm meal for his trouble, she had the great stone slid onto a borrowed sledge and hauled the long, jolting mile up to Widow's Corner before the light failed. It was 2 days later, while Eleanor was scraping moss and old grime from the stone surface to make it fit to serve as a proper hearth base, that her rag caught on something along the altar's underside that was not simply rough granite. Kneeling in the cold mud, she found a seam, so finely cut and so carefully fitted that only decades of frost and settling earth had finally worked it slightly open, a seam that ran the width of the stone's base as though the block had never been a single solid piece at all, but two, joined together by a mason's exacting hand. Her fingers, roughened as they were by years of scrubbing and stitching, trembled slightly as she worked a flat iron bar into the gap and pried, gently at first, and then with more determined effort, until with a groan of old stone against old stone, a slab nearly the size of a serving tray shifted and lifted away, revealing a hollow chamber cut deep into the altar's heart, and lying within it, wrapped in oiled canvas gone stiff and brittle with age, a bundle that had clearly been placed there, deliberately and with great care, a very long time ago. Eleanor sat back on her heels in the cold mud of Widow's Corner and did not open the bundle right away. She has told, in later years, of how her hands shook not from cold, but from something nearer to reverence, the same feeling she'd once had as a girl kneeling in her mother's church, and how she thought, absurdly perhaps, of the old story of the bride who never left the chapel, and wondered for one long, breath-held moment whether she was about to disturb something that had been left sealed on purpose. But her mother's voice came to her too, the old refrain about nothing being too poor or too small to deserve a careful look, and so at last she drew back the stiffened canvas and found inside it a wedding dress, ivory once and yellowed now, folded with extraordinary care around a small cedar box, and tucked beneath both, protected from moisture by a second wrapping of oilcloth, a thick, sealed packet of papers bound with wax cord. She did not read the papers that first night. She was too cold and too shaken, and the light was failing, and so she carried everything carefully inside her half-built shelter and sat with it near her small fire until morning, when she finally opened the cedar box first and found within it a woman's wedding ring, small and plain, a single dried and pressed larkspur bloom flattened nearly to lace by the decades, and a folded letter written in a careful, looping hand. The letter, addressed simply to whoever finds this, in God's good time, was signed by Emmett Doyle, stonemason, and dated the 14th of June, 1851. In it, Emmett explained, in the plain, unadorned language of a grieving father, that his daughter Marguerite had died of a sudden fever on the eve of her wedding day, before she ever wore the dress sewn for her, and that in his sorrow he had built this chapel and this altar with his own hands, hiding within its heart both his daughter's dress and ring, and something else, he wrote, something he judged more important than any grief of his own, the original deed and charter by which he, in the settlement's founding families, had set aside the creekside meadows and grazing commons of what would become Larkspur Hollow to be held forever in common trust for the whole community, and never sold, divided, or claimed by any single family or interest. He had hidden it there, he wrote, because there were men even then eager to seize such open land for themselves, and because he trusted the chapel, built in his daughter's memory, to be a place people would respect and leave undisturbed far longer than any courthouse strongbox, not knowing, of course, that respect fades faster than stone. Eleanor unwound the wax cord from the second, thicker packet with hands that had gone entirely steady now, steady by purpose rather than shaken by cold, and found within it the deed itself, still legible, still bearing the notarized seal of the Territorial Land Office and the signatures of 11 founding families of Larkspur Hollow, granting the creekside commons and grazing meadows in perpetual trust to the people of the settlement, to be governed by no single owner, and specifically in language that Emmett Doyle had evidently insisted upon, never to be mortgaged, sold, or seized by any bank or private note. She read it 3 times through before she allowed herself to understand what she was holding and what it meant not only for the mountain, and not only for the memory of a girl named Marguerite who had died before she could wear her dress, but for every family in Larkspur Hollow who did not yet know that the ground much of their livelihood depended upon had never legally belonged to anyone at all in the way the town's bank now quietly assumed. It did not take Eleanor long, once she had recovered her wits, to understand why the old legend claimed the bride never left the chapel, nor why it had persisted so stubbornly for decades, discouraging exactly the kind of careless disturbance that might have exposed the altar's secret far too soon. Word, however, travels quickly in a small mountain town, and it was not many days before Josiah Crane learned that the widow he had turned out of her own boarding house had been seen carrying strange old papers into the county recorder's office, papers that an elderly clerk, once he examined them properly, declared with visible astonishment to be entirely authentic and entirely, gravely significant for Crane's bank. It turned out, held mortgages against no fewer than 6 properties in Larkspur Hollow, whose underlying land, according to this newly surfaced 1851 deed, had never been the private property of the mortgage families in the first place, but common land held in trust, land that could not lawfully be pledged, foreclosed upon, or seized at all. Crane did not take this news quietly. He arrived at the recorder's office within the hour, demanding to see the document himself, insisting loudly that it must be a forgery, some trick cooked up by a bitter, desperate woman looking for revenge against the man who had, in his own words, only done what any honest banker must. He called Eleanor's discovery a scheme, hinted publicly that a woman alone, recently evicted and clearly not in her right mind, might have manufactured such papers out of spite, and worked hard in the days that followed to turn what sympathy remained for Eleanor Whitfield into suspicion instead, reminding anyone who would listen that she had, after all, bought a cursed stone from a haunted chapel. And who could say what else she might have hidden inside it herself? Several of the town's more anxious families, fearful of losing what little security their mortgage homesteads seemed to offer, sided uneasily with Crane, unwilling to believe that ground they had worked and paid for their whole lives might never have been anyone's to sell them in the first place. Eleanor found herself, for a time, more isolated than she had been even in the depths of her grief for Thomas, regarded by half the town as either a fraud or a fool, standing nearly alone at Widow's Corner with nothing but a genuine deed, a dead bride's dress, and the quiet, unglamorous conviction her mother had planted in her decades before, that a thing dismissed as worthless deserves, still, to be looked at closely before it is thrown away. It was the old teamster, Silas Pruitt, of all people, who first stood publicly at her side, telling anyone who would listen that he had personally hauled the altar stone himself and seen with his own eyes that the seam in the granite was old, weathered, and utterly undisturbed by any recent tampering, exactly the kind of aging no forger could fake in a matter of days. It was the county recorder, too, a careful and unbending man named Otis Bell, who confirmed publicly that the notarial seal upon the deed matched, stroke for stroke, seals used by the Territorial Land Office in the exact years claimed, seals that had, in fact, been retired and changed entirely by 1860, a detail no forger in 1897 would have any reason to know or trouble to replicate. And it was, in the end, Marguerite Doyle's own younger sister, a frail but sharp-minded woman named Cora Doyle Ames, still living in a neighboring valley at the age of 70, who came forward once she heard the news, confirming through her own tears that she remembered her father Emmett's grief so well that she remembered too the months he had spent up on that mountain with his chisels, remembered him telling her, as a girl of 11, that he was building something into that altar that the town would need someday, though he never said what, and had made her swear never to speak carelessly of it. With her testimony, and the physical evidence Otis Bell laid out plainly before the territorial circuit judge who was summoned to rule on the matter, Josiah Crane's protests curdled quickly from outrage into something far quieter and far more desperate, for it became clear within a single hearing that his own bank's records showed he had known, or at minimum strongly suspected irregularities in several of the very land titles he had been lending against, and had proceeded anyway, confident that no one would ever look closely enough to notice. The judge's ruling, delivered on a bright, cold morning in late November with half the town crowded into the little courthouse to hear it, restored the creekside commons and grazing meadows to the people of Larkspur Hollow exactly as Emmett Doyle's deed had intended nearly 50 years before, voided the disputed mortgages Crane's bank had improperly pressed against land that had never lawfully been collateral at all, and referred the question of Josiah Crane's conduct to the territorial banking examiner for further inquiry, a process that would, over the following year, strip him quietly of his charter and his standing in the very town he had once smiled his way through every Sunday. Eleanor Whitfield, for her part, wanted none of the land for herself, and said so plainly the moment the ruling came down, reminding the gathered townspeople that the deed had never been about enriching any one family, hers included, but about honoring what Emmett Doyle and Marguerite's memory had asked of them, that the commons remain common, held in trust for everyone. What she did ask for, and receive, without objection from a single soul in that courtroom, was permission to use a portion of the restored trust funds, modest fees the commons could now properly collect from grazing leases once administered honestly rather than skimmed by Crane's bank, to rebuild the old mountain chapel itself, not as a monument to sorrow this time, but as a proper meeting hall and schoolroom for the town, with the altar stone, mended and whole again, set at its heart exactly where Emmett Doyle had first placed it. The chapel was rebuilt through the following spring and summer, largely by volunteer hands, Silas Pruitt among the first to offer his back to the work, and when it was finished, Eleanor Whitfield herself stitched, from good new cloth donated by half the women of Larkspur Hollow, a simple altar cloth to lay across the mended stone, embroidering into one corner, small and unobtrusive, a single larkspur bloom in memory of the bride who had waited so long inside that stone to finish what her father had asked of her. And so we return, as we so often do in stories like this one, to where we began, to a woman of 47 with $11.40, standing in the cold beside a stone that everyone else had judged worthless, cursed, not worth the trouble of a second look. Eleanor Whitfield did not buy that altar stone because she believed in ghosts or hidden treasure. She bought it because she had been taught, long ago, and by a mother who never had much herself, that nothing poor or plain or forgotten is ever truly without value until someone has taken the trouble to look closely enough to be sure. It was that same patient, unglamorous conviction, more than any stroke of luck, that returned to the people of Larkspur Hollow the land that had always, rightfully, been theirs, that ended the quiet reach of a man who had mistaken smiling confidence for honesty, and that finally led a bride who died before her wedding rest, her long and faithful watch over her father's promise complete at last. Thank you for sitting with us through Eleanor's story tonight, and for spending this quiet hour of your evening in the cold, honest air of Larkspur Hollow. If this story moved you, we would be so grateful if you would share it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things and overlooked people so often carry more worth than the world is willing to admit. We would love to know, in the comments below, about a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off, an old object, an old place, or perhaps even an old, tired part of yourself. Until next time, stay close.